A new front has opened, one that few could have predicted just months earlier. It's happening on the world's longest undefended border, a line that for generations has been a symbol of peace and trust. On a tense Thursday in March 2025, British Columbia Premier David Eby announced a plan that stunned both Canadians and Alaskans: legislation to impose tolls on commercial trucks traveling through BC to Alaska. The announcement sent shockwaves through political and business circles on both sides of the border. This was no minor fee hike, it was a direct response to escalating U.S. trade threats, a move that signaled a new willingness to use economic leverage. The Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act gave BC the power to charge vehicles using its highways as a land bridge to Alaska, a route that had always been open and free for American goods. While tolls weren't immediately imposed, the act put a powerful tool on the table, signaling BC was ready to fight back if U.S. pressure continued. The message was clear: Canada would not stand by quietly. For decades, the route through Canada symbolized friendship and cooperation. Now it had become a geopolitical fault line, a place where old alliances were being tested by new realities. The news hit Alaska hard. The state, isolated from the rest of the U.S., relies on Canadian goodwill for its land-based supply routes. For many Alaskans, the border was more than a line, it was a lifeline. The idea of paying a toll just to move goods from one part of America to another was shocking. It challenged assumptions about the permanence of open borders and free passage. Suddenly, the physical link connecting Alaska to the lower 48 was threatened, not by nature, but by politics. The uncertainty rippled through communities and businesses alike. Alaskans faced the prospect of higher costs for everything from groceries to industrial equipment. The economic impact could be felt in every corner of the state, from remote villages to bustling towns. The easy access they'd long taken for granted was now in jeopardy. Families and businesses alike wondered how they would adapt if the tolls became reality. The world watched, wondering if this bold move would cool tensions or ignite them further. News outlets speculated about the next steps, and leaders on both sides weighed their options. The highways of British Columbia were no longer just roads, they were now the front lines of a new economic conflict, where every mile carried the weight of international consequences. British Columbia's dramatic move was fueled by mounting frustration and a growing sense of being cornered by forces beyond its control. For months, officials and citizens alike watched anxiously as tensions escalated, feeling the pressure build with every new threat from south of the border. Premier Eby's action was part of a coordinated Team Canada response to President Trump's threat of a sweeping 25% tariff on all Canadian goods, a move that would have sent shockwaves through the entire Canadian economy. For Canada, whose economy is deeply tied to the U.S., such a tariff would be catastrophic, threatening jobs, businesses, and the livelihoods of countless families. BC, a major trade hub and gateway for goods moving between the two countries, felt especially vulnerable and decided a strong, visible response was necessary to protect its interests. The toll legislation was a clear message. Canada had leverage too and was willing to use it if pushed too far. Beyond economics, there was a deep sense of betrayal. Canadians felt their special partnership with the U.S. was being violated, and that years of trust were suddenly at risk. Yukon Premier Ranj Pillai summed it up best: "This is not how you treat your friends." His words echoed the feelings of many across the country. The tolls were designed as a defensive tool, targeting a unique American vulnerability, the Alaska Highway, a vital link for Alaskans traveling through Canada. BC wanted Washington and the rest of the U.S. to know that economic pain could go both ways, and that Canada would not simply stand by. It was a calculated risk, meant to force both sides back to the negotiating table and remind everyone of the value of cooperation. National pride and sovereignty were now at stake, and British Columbia's bold action became a rallying point for Canadians determined to defend their country's interests. The crisis began when President Trump reignited his America First trade policy, this time taking direct aim at Canada with a proposed 25% tariff on all commerce between the two countries. The announcement sent shockwaves through both nations, as businesses and political leaders scrambled to understand the implications. The president's approach was unpredictable. He would announce the tariff, then delay it, only to revive the threat again, days later. This constant back and forth created chaos and uncertainty for businesses on both sides of the border, leaving many unable to plan for the future. Trump's rhetoric escalated even further, as he began to hint at the possibility of the annexation of Canada, not through military means but by wielding overwhelming economic force. For Canadians, this was no longer just a trade dispute, it felt like an existential threat to their sovereignty and way of life. The sense of unease spread quickly, touching every corner of the country. The Canadian government, led by Prime Minister Trudeau, was forced into a defensive posture, urgently consulting with advisors and allies to craft a response. On March 5, 2025, Trudeau announced a sweeping set of retaliatory tariffs on American goods, signaling that Canada would not back down without a fight. The situation quickly escalated, as provincial leaders like David Eby and Doug Ford took their own measures to protect their regions, adding to the growing sense of crisis. Trump's gambit had an unintended effect. It united Canadians across political lines, transforming what began as a trade spat into a powerful national cause. Rallies and protests erupted, with citizens demanding action. The intricate supply chains and deep economic ties that had long bound the two nations together were suddenly at risk, threatening jobs and livelihoods across North America. The relationship had become a zero-sum game, with both sides bracing for impact and preparing for a prolonged standoff. The crisis had now become the most severe rupture in modern U.S. Canada relations, overshadowing decades of cooperation and trust. The stakes had never been higher, and the world was watching to see what would happen next. BC's proposed tolls threaten Alaska's fragile supply chain. While most cargo arrives by sea, the Alaska Highway is the state's economic lifeline for critical time-sensitive goods. Tolls would act as a tax, especially hurting fresh food and the oil industry. Alaska State Senator Robert Myers, a trucker himself, warned that higher costs would hit consumers hard, making groceries even more expensive. The oil industry relies on trucks for urgent equipment. Delays could cripple operations. The Alaska Trucking Association predicted a cascade of negative effects, from disrupted supply chains to higher prices on essentials. Anything that needs to get to Alaska fast comes by truck. The tolls threaten to squeeze this vital flow, making life more difficult and costly for Alaskans. Alaska's leaders responded with urgency and concern. Governor Mike Dunleavy called for calm and urged that the dispute be resolved at the federal level, not between states and provinces. U.S. Senator Dan Sullivan saw BC's move as a direct threat and promised retaliation. Sullivan proposed waiving the Passenger Vessel Services Act, allowing cruise ships to bypass Canadian ports, a major blow to BC's tourism sector. Business leaders scrambled to assess new costs and alternative shipping routes. Alaskans felt caught in the middle, their livelihoods at risk from a political battle beyond their control. The state's unique geography makes it dependent on stable relations with Canada. The dispute was a stark reminder of how quickly politics can disrupt daily life. While some called for retaliation, many hoped for a quick, peaceful resolution. The desire for a return to quiet partnership was strong on both sides of the border. BC's toll threat was just one part of a nationwide Canadian response. Provinces and the federal government united in a rare show of solidarity. Ontario imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity sold to the U.S., targeting a vital energy link. Yukon stopped buying American alcohol and limited U.S. access to government contracts. Public sentiment was strong, some even called for highway tolls and bans on American figures. BC expanded its retaliation, ordering government agencies to buy Canadian and removing U.S. products from liquor stores. These boycotts targeted specific American producers and states. At the federal level, Trudeau's government imposed its own retaliatory tariffs. The combined measures created a formidable wall of economic resistance. Canada made it clear it would not accept American tariffs without a fight. U.S. politicians, especially from Alaska, quickly countered Canada's moves. Senator Dan Sullivan proposed waiving the Passenger Vessel Services Act, allowing cruise ships to bypass BC ports. This would devastate BC's tourism economy, which relies on millions of cruise passengers each summer. Hotels, restaurants, and tour operators in cities like Vancouver and Victoria would suffer massive losses. The threat was real. The law had been waived before during the pandemic. The cruise ship gambit showed that Alaska and its allies had powerful leverage too. Economic interdependence cut both ways. The stakes were now higher than ever, with both sides risking mutual economic destruction. The conflict had become a high-stakes game of chicken. Would this brinkmanship force compromise or lead to deeper confrontation? Amid the political drama, ordinary people on both sides of the border felt the strain. Travel between Canada and the U.S. dropped sharply, as many Canadians quietly protested by canceling trips. Yet cross-border friendships endured. Events like the Buckwheat International Ski Classic in Alaska saw strong Canadian participation, a gesture of citizen diplomacy. Canadians emphasized their frustration was with government policies, not their Alaskan neighbors. In border communities, families and businesses span both sides, making the political conflict feel personal. People worked to separate politics from personal relationships, determined to preserve their shared community. These grassroots efforts to maintain goodwill offered hope for the future. The strength of these connections could help both nations weather the current storm. As of June 8, 2025, the U.S. and Canada stand at a crossroads. The best-case scenario is swift de-escalation. Leaders step in, suspend tariffs and tolls, and return to negotiations. The worst case, a full-blown trade war with BC imposing tolls and the U.S. waiving cruise ship laws, devastating both economies. A third possibility is a prolonged standoff with threats hanging over the border and uncertainty chilling investment. The relationship could settle into a tense, cold peace, fundamentally changed. Ultimately, the future depends on political leaders, but also on the voices of ordinary citizens. The enduring friendships and economic ties between Alaska, Yukon and BC may yet pull both sides back from the brink. Shared history and interdependence could compel compromise. The road ahead is uncertain, but the deep-rooted connections between neighbors may prove more resilient than the current political storm. The world is watching to see if cooler heads will prevail.